Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode in the FIA Group's podcast, Empowering Plans. I am John Jablon, and with me today is Kendall Jackson. Say hi, Kendall.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you
Happy
for
Monday.
not saying hi, Kendall. I hate that so much. Brady does it because Ron did it, and on the webinar the other day, Brian O'Hara did it, and it just drives me nuts. But thanks for acting like a normal person. So today we want to talk about a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts, and probably all of your hearts. The No Surprises Act. I feel like we've talked about this thousands of times, right? Over the last what year are we in? Over the last 5 years on calls and webinars and podcasts and emails. I mean, it's a broad topic. There's a lot to talk about, and that is still the case, right? It never ends. There's always updates and interesting stuff happening. There's cases. There's laws proposed in Congress. I mean, it seems like there's a never-ending stream of news regarding the No Surprises Act, which in a way is a good thing, right? Because so many people are dissatisfied with the current state. So the fact that it's evolving means that there's at least potential for things to get better for the various parties. But, you know, there's small wins for providers. There's small wins for health plans in terms of the law and regulations and whatnot. And today we're going to talk about, both of those. I guess we've got a mix here. So again, thanks for tuning in. And Kendall, I know, has a lot to say about the volume of IDR and win rates and things like that. So I'm going to let her get it kicked off right now. Kendall.
Yeah, thanks, John. Since the IDR process became operational in 2022, I think the regulators initially sort of thought that it was going to be not as burdensome as it has sort of ended up being. And we've seen a really, really large volume of disputes since 2022. There's been just over 5.1 million disputes initiated between April 15, 2022 and the end of January of 2026. Now, nearly all of those have been initiated by providers, and the most common disputes are initiated for emergency services in comparison to disputes for out-of-network providers at in-network facilities or air ambulance. So the overwhelming majority are disputes for emergency services. But I know the original estimates were around like 17,000 IDR disputes per year, and that's just not what we're seeing. In January alone, the CMS data shows that there were about 250,000 new disputes just in January 2026. So very much out of line with what sort of the original projections were going to be. And this data is very useful because we can sort of see the trends and how disputes are initiated, but also how certain parties are winning the majority of times over others. And so the CMS data indicates that providers are winning around 88% of the time. And that actually remains consistent with what we've seen in prior years as well. There was a congressional report that showed in 2023 and 2024 that the IDR entity selected the provider's offer around 80 to 85% of the time. So that 88% that we're seeing from the CMS data is pretty much consistent. It's a little bit higher, but very much in line with the trends in prior years as well. And we're seeing sort of the provider's offer favored a lot more than we are the plans.
Yeah, and Kendall, along the lines of what you were saying about how when the Congress first proposed the NSA, they were assuming about 17,000 disputes a year, and it's 70 times that or something like that, right? Yeah. In reality, they had also assumed that the IDR cases were going to be split much more evenly between initiation by plans and initiation by providers, where in reality, what we've seen from the published CMS data, and I mentioned this on the webinar the other day, health plans have initiated 0.011% of all IDR disputes, like 0.011%, basically almost none. It's like 100 out of like, I don't even know. But yeah, so I think we've had a lot of people ask us why that is the case. And I think the answer comes down to, why would a health plan challenge its own payment? right? I mean, if you feel that the payment the provider is requesting is too high, the plan pays less, right? The plan pays based on the plan document. You don't just pay the demanded amount and then say, I paid too much, I'm going to challenge it. No, you just pay less, right? I mean, that's sort of the inherent problem that NSA was first trying to solve, where a lot of the providers and facilities were saying, health plans pay us too little and there's no real way to make them pay more. I mean, yeah, right? Like that's sort of how insurance works. And the ball is in the provider's court, and then the ball is in the health plan's court. And the No Surprises Act has, I mean, many say that they've put it sort of back in the provider's court to now challenge the health plan's payment, as opposed to the true intent, which is for either party to, to challenge the amount. It's like, well, we know what you're really talking about, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because a disproportionate number of disputes are actually driven by a few private equity backed groups. The data from 2025 shows that around 44% to around half of that, around 50% of disputes were initiated by just 3 entities. And so there's a lot of allegations that they're sort of attempting to use the NSA's arbitration process as sort of a business strategy to maximize reimbursement rates. So that's sort of concerning on its own. And it hasn't gone unnoticed, though. I know there was a case sort of recently filed on allegations that a collection of hospital facilities were fraudulently overusing the NSA arbitration process to inflate out of network payments. So it seems like this isn't sort of flying under the radar entirely, and people are very much aware of this. So hopefully it gets sort of challenged and we don't see sort of this abuse of the IDR process, because obviously that wasn't the original intention for it to begin with.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But yeah, but it's good that it's being challenged, and hopefully if with these challenges, we'll see a decrease in the total number of disputes filed, since a lot of the disputes filed are from these entities, which will inevitably help with the large volume of disputes that are filed generally. But the departments are also just sort of actively trying to reduce the backlog of disputes that we've had. The CMS report that I mentioned earlier from 2025 indicated that the departments added 2 new certified IDR entities who could accept new disputes and also sort of help with that backlog. And that increased the total number at the time of IDR entities to 15, which is great, because the more IDR entities that we have to sort of handle these disputes and help with the backlog, the more efficiently the IDR process will run. And so that'll help in the long run too with the volume that we're seeing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that if you tune into our webinar, I guess it was last week, one of our provider relations attorneys, Brian O'Hara, talked a lot about how the IDR process and the open negotiation process, they're not really, in a lot of cases, they're not humans, right? It's not just like people doing these. It's machines, right? I mean, there's AI involved. I mean, it's an industrialized process at this point. So true meaningful negotiation has become almost impossible for the majority of claims, is what Brian was explaining. And that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, when the volume's this high, who has the capacity rather to have individual people dealing with every single one of these claims? No, it gets industrialized. It becomes just mechanical. So that kind of stunts the system, right? I mean, it's supposed to be true good faith negotiations. It's supposed to be a reasoned, human-driven IDR process, but instead it's just sort of, the same thing over and over, the same submissions, the same arguments, everything is the same, and nothing is sort of tailored to the claim anymore, which is tough. Yeah. So thanks, Kendall. There's been a law proposed in Congress. It's Senate Bill 2420. It's an attempt to try to create what they call penalty parity for health plans. Because right now, if a provider unlawfully balance bills a patient in violation of the No Surprises Act, penalties can be up to $10,000. But for a health plan that doesn't pay its IDR award, penalties are basically $100 a day. And hospitals are looking at that and saying, like, well, why am I being penalized so much? Whereas these plans that aren't paying what they're apparently legally required to pay, their penalties are up to $100 a day and often not even being enforced, or at least not even reviewed yet. So there's the Senate bill, which is basically trying to require the departments, the DOL, the Treasury, and HHS to report, not only impose enforcement for the same $10,000 risk, right? If you don't pay an IDR award, $10,000 fine. But they're trying to require the departments to do formal reporting every year to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to do and enforcing this the right way, which a lot of people have expressed is a little bit ironic because this law already disproportionately favors providers. So the providers are annoyed, like the providers want the government to do reporting to prove that they're enforcing it against plans. A lot of people view that as kind of disingenuous, where like you're already winning like 100% of the time. Relax, But it's truly, it's not 100, right? It's 88. So there is room for error there. But also, of the 88% of the time that providers win at IDR, I don't have stats on how often plans don't pay that award, right? I mean, there are a lot of plans that look at the IDR award and say, no, this is ridiculous. Or worse yet, right? There are IDR proceedings that go on and the plan looks back and says, this was not eligible to begin with. This is totally bogus. The IDR entity should have kicked it out, but they didn't. I'm not paying this. And this law would attempt to get plans to be fined $10,000 even, for not paying a bogus award. Whereas this law does not really do much to stem the flow of the improper awards being given and all the various IDR proceedings that are not going off actually as they're supposed to be. The law sort of pretends that isn't happening. The law is attempting to pretend that every IDR award is valid, and if you don't pay it, you should be penalized. Whereas in reality, a lot of the time when plans don't pay their IDR awards, it's because they should never have been issued to begin with. And that's tough. It's a tough balance to strike because it's very fact specific, and it's hard to know definitively when, which is the case, one or the other. Is it valid? Is it invalid? And who can prove that? And what right do you even have to assert it? These are all questions, I should say, that the NSA kind of left up in the air and that this bill is not attempting to solve. The bill is just slapping a penalty without trying to figure out whether it actually makes sense to penalize. So it's an interesting bill, and who knows what'll happen to it in its final form if it even makes it that far, right? But it's sort of a concept bill at the moment. And there are a couple of lawsuits that we'll touch on. One is the Texas Medical Association 3 about ghost rates. There have been a few Texas Medical Association cases. This one is about what's called ghost rates. And ghost rates are really interesting because essentially the theory is that when a provider contracts with a plan, whether through a network or directly, a provider could bill any number of services, even if they're out of specialty, right? I mean, the idea is that like a dermatologist, for instance, right? When a dermatologist is in network, the dermatologist is still going to be subject to the network rates no matter what services they bill. Now, they're not going to be billing certain services, right? A dermatologist is not going to be billing, for instance, a labor and delivery charge. That would be weird, right? But there still is technically a contracted rate for that service, just because in some possible universe it exists, right? The provider is not prohibited from providing that service under the network contract, and therefore it is a contracted rate. In this suit, the concept of ghost rates are kind of along those lines, where you're basically, when you're looking at median contracted rates, you're not just looking at the providers that actually provide the services, you're not just looking at the services that are actually provided by those providers, but ghost rates entail basically saying like, well, the average labor and delivery charge is skewed because this dermatologist has this rate, whereas since the dermatologist is never going to be performing a labor and delivery service, they probably didn't care about the rates for those services. They probably just like, whatever, it doesn't matter. But if it skews the rates, then the rates are skewed. And it's already happened and it's too late. So what the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals said is that the government is okay to allow ghost rates as part of the QPA calculation, which is, I would say, not entirely intuitive, right? Because when we're looking at rates that providers actually charge, wouldn't it make sense that we look at real rates, not like these theoretical rates that I guess could be imposed under some random set of circumstances, but it's not real, right? It's not real life. And that's a major impetus for that Senate Bill 2420, where when we're talking about IDR and No Surprise Act violations and everything. They're sort of relying on the IDR entities to get this right and make sure that the amounts awarded for IDR are correct and that plans are paying them. That's one of the things that this bill that I was just talking about is designed to do, is just make sure that everyone does exactly what they're supposed to do. But meanwhile, the Fifth Circuit has said, yeah, ghost rates are fine. And everyone's like, what, really? That okay. So we'll see what happens there. I mean, for all we know, there will be a circuit split in the Supreme Court. Might look at it eventually. It's funny. There's a lot of stuff going on right now where we find ourselves saying there's probably going to be a circuit split about this at some point. Hopefully, the Supreme Court will weigh in, because right now all we've got are these kind of like fragmented laws, and that's how it works, of course. But when it's something so pervasive and all encompassing as the No Surprises Act, it's kind of dangerous that different jurisdictions do things differently, and then people are citing them for precedent, even though it's technically not in their jurisdiction. It's a mess, an absolute mess. So Kendall, before we go, do you want to talk about the other case, the Aetna case, which is kind of like, I don't want to say it's like the opposite of that, but it's sort of like a converse.
Yeah. I feel like this is just like sort of another instance where the IDR process sort of isn't going to plan, and sort of how the NSA works and how the QPA works is just sort of, because we have so much sort of flux with the guidance and things aren't very straightforward. There's just been a lot of confusion and sort of leading to issues. But yes, so there was a CMS audit of Aetna Health of Texas in July of 2024. And so the audit focused on 4 air ambulance HCPCS codes. And so upon conducting this audit, they found that Aetna actually used the paid amounts to calculate the QPA instead of using the required contracted rates. And the QPA is supposed to be based on contracted rates, not actually paid amounts. And so because Aetna did this, it artificially skewed the QPA math, which could be really damaging in the long run for plans. So what they did was Aetna counted each individual claim as sort of a separate, distinct contracted rate. Which obviously just led to these miscalculations, resulted in much higher QPAs. And obviously, as John mentioned earlier, these higher QPAs and these higher median amounts are very damaging in the long run for plans, if plans are required to pay that, especially when we see provider offers winning the majority of the time. It could be very costly in the long run. So I guess it's a good thing that they're conducting these audits and trying to hold certain entities accountable for not following how certain calculations can be performed. But it sort of just makes you wonder how many other instances where this is happening where we just aren't aware of it yet.
Yeah, it's also a great example about how like literally every word of the statute and regulation can matter, right? I mean, when we're talking about paying the QPA and how to calculate it, contracted rates versus paid rates.
Yeah.
Historically, right before the NSA, a lot of people would look at those and be like, well, that's the same thing, right? If we have this as a contracted rate and we paid this, what's the difference? Well, the NSA really does draw a distinction, right? I mean, the problem is that like if you pay 10 claims at a certain rate, but it's just one contracted rate, should it count as 10 or should it count as 1? And I think what the government is saying is, well, it counts as 1 because it's a contracted rate. Like if you paid it 10 times under the same contract, it's still just one contract. So it comes down to, like every word of the legislation as well as the legislative intent, right? I mean, because if you look at the intent, this audit of Aetna was focused on the idea that you are basically artificially increasing the number of data points you have to calculate your QPA, which inherently skews it. So it's more data points are better, but they have to be the right data points. And in this industry, we often look at it as like, well, how would more data points be a bad thing? Well, more data points are a bad thing when they skew an average. And that's how averages work. And that's why it's a problem. And I don't believe there's been a settlement or anything yet, but it's being looked into. And I think it's become pretty clear that doing it the way it was done in this case, where you're counting paid amounts as your data points, I think it's become pretty clear that is not what we're supposed to be doing. So with that, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining this episode of the podcast. If you have questions, please feel free to write into either pgcreferral@viagroup.com or your dedicated ICE inbox. On behalf of myself, John Jablon, and Kendall Jackson, thank you. And we'll talk soon. Take care.